But on October 1st, 1863, a 19-year-old man named Solomon King completed his journey from Buxton, Canada. It's Canada West, which is present-day Ontario province. And he completed his journey to Detroit. The next day, he signed his enlistment papers. He signed enlistment papers for 3 years and joined the 1st Michigan Colored Infantry, which was later reorganized as the 102nd, and I typically go back and forth between the two titles. Solomon was born a slave in Louisiana, and at the age of probably 4 or 5, he was brought to Canada with his master, William King. William King was the founder of the all-black settlement at Buxton, which was the focus of my dissertation and then the first book. Solomon then grew up free. Well, when he's 19 years old, he comes back to Detroit, or goes to Detroit, and enlists. After a couple of weeks, he was appointed as a recruiting sergeant and subsequently spent several months going around the state of Michigan encouraging other young men to enlist in the 1st Michigan. And then after a brief stint in a hospital for an illness, I don't know what it was yet, he joins the regiment in May of 1864. It was then down at Annapolis. He serves with the units through their entire service, musters out with them in September of 1865. And then unlike a lot of his companions who go back to Michigan, Solomon stayed in South Carolina. He relocated to Charleston, which is where he married a woman named Sarah Richardson. Apparently he met her during the occupation of Charleston that the 102nd performed February-March of 1865. Solomon and his wife Sarah raised their family there until he died in 1881. And it's Solomon's story that first interested me in the 102nd, and once the book was done, that new project of what am I going to do next, it became the 102nd because there's a lot of men from Buxton who served in this same regiment. So it's his story that is then now turned into this rather massive, and as I'm calling it now, multi-life project, because there doesn't seem to be any end to it. The 102nd was only one of close to 200 regiments composed of black soldiers in the Civil War. It's not as celebrated as others. Most people probably never even heard of the 1st Michigan or the 102nd. It's not been in glory or any of the other things that sort of highlight more of the black regiments. But in large part it's because of that I think its commonality, its ordinariness, can really speak to the overall experiences of black soldiers in the Civil War. It's more of the common experiences, I think. In many respects, little distinguishes the 102nd from that of other regiments, with the exception of 2 major engagements, both of which were in South Carolina. One was Honey Hill on November 30th, 1864, the other a few weeks later at DeVoe Neck. Excuse me. The unit saw little action besides skirmishing. Most of their wartime experience instead consisted of drilling and marching, engaging in picket duty, garrison, fatigue duty, those kinds of things, destroying railroads, building fortifications, with the exception of a month-long excursion into Florida in August of 1864, and then some occupying duty around Charleston, Orangeburg, and Winnsboro. Most of their service was in the environs around Hilton Head and Beaufort. The 1st Michigan Colored Infantry was the only African-American regiment organized in that state, and it was one of only a handful of state-raised northern black regiments. Although it did not retain its state designation, like the 54th Massachusetts or 55th Massachusetts, the unit was able to retain a lot of its identity and independence as the 1st Michigan. Even after the change in designation, you can see the enlistment papers, regimental returns, the company muster rolls, all of the paperwork. You see the 1st Michigan either alone or alongside the 102nd designation. So they were able to maintain some of that identity on their own. It also seems, and I think this is part of the identity, that men who served as substitutes had an opportunity to specify that they wanted to serve in the 102nd. John Anderson, enrolling as a substitute for Charles Hoadley, a white man who was enrolled in Michigan, noted a preference for placement in 1st Michigan, as did Virginia-born Horace Brown. Joseph West's enlistment paper states, substitute selected as his regiment, the 1st Michigan Colored. Used to help relieve some of the pressures of the draft, since their numbers were credited to Michigan's quota. I think that the choosing of the regiment as where they wanted to serve was used as a recruiting tool. Now, the basic demographics of the soldiers of the 102nd are in most respects typical of Civil War regiments, black or white. Their average age was 26, which is a little bit older than most regiments, which is about 23, 24, I think. There were over 120 soldiers who were 35 years of age or older. At least 200, and it's probably a little bit more, had their ages listed as 18, which was the most common age at enlistment in the Civil War. I found the youngest recorded soldier, at least so far, is 15-year-old George York, and he was 15 when he enlisted. At the other end of the spectrum, the oldest recorded recruit, and I say recorded because there's an issue later on, you'll see that he might not be the oldest. The oldest recorded recruit was 53-year-old Harry Ellicott. Now, the accuracy of the ages is somewhat suspect because they're recorded on their enlistment papers, but oftentimes black men, whether they had been slaves or free before their enlistment, were unsure of their exact dates of birth. The majority of the 102nd soldiers were skilled laborers or farmers, as most Civil War soldiers were, but peppered among them were a wide range of skilled workers. The largest number of kind of other, besides farmers and laborers, is boat hands or sailors. And that's probably because of the connection to Detroit and then their commercial role with the Great Lakes and things like that. Next to boat hands, barbering was the most common occupation, and that mirrors the prevalence of barbering as an occupation within the black community overall. Other skilled workers were Joseph Battis, a cigar maker, Albert Hungerford, a mechanic, Thomas Brock, an engineer, William Boyles, a rope maker, and Little Stewart, who was a gunsmith. And then mixed in there, you've got carpenters and masons and blacksmiths and shoemakers, waiters, clothes washers, stewards, cooks, all sorts of different occupations. Some men were musicians, and then there was at least one physician. James B.F. Curtis was born in Wyoming County, New York. His enlistment papers showed that he was a 24-year-old free-born physician. He enlisted as a private, but fairly shortly after his enlistment, he is appointed as the hospital steward, and he is moved to the field and staff list for the rest of the war. There's some indication, I can't prove this yet, but there's some indication that Curtis went to the University of Michigan to receive his medical degree. I'm not sure if he graduated, and I'm not sure whether the administrators there knew of his race. It does appear that Curtis could and did at times pass as white. On at least 2 post-war census records, he is listed as white. With few exceptions, the men who enlisted in the 102nd did so from within Michigan. They did acquire some recruits in Annapolis when they were there for a couple of weeks. They also added some new recruits in Florida when they were there for a month in '64. But for the most part, the men enlist in Michigan. There's also evidence that soldiers who lived in the sort of surrounding Midwestern states came to Michigan and enlisted in Michigan. Although I have found 2 men who enlisted in Wisconsin and at least one who enlisted in Indiana. Of particular interest is a soldier named Isaac Dunbar. According to his service record, Isaac enlisted in Hagerstown, Maryland on August 8th of 1864. He was credited to Hagerstown, Washington County, Maryland. But he was mustered into service in Detroit and then sent out with a detachment bound for the 102nd from Jacksonville, Michigan on August 11th. Given that it's a little bit improbable that he enlisted at Hagerstown and then mustered in and deployed from Detroit. I think what probably happened is he enlisted in Detroit, but was credited to Hagerstown, Maryland. I do know that he served as a substitute for Frederick Dorsey, who was a white man enrolled in Washington County, Maryland. Why Isaac Dunbar substituted for a man enrolled in Michigan, I don't know, but I think that's the case. And then there's some other issues with Isaac Dunbar. According to his records, his muster-out rolls and some other records, he's listed as free, but there's other evidence to suggest otherwise. There's documents in his military service record that showed that he very well likely was a slave. After the war, Thomas Dunbar, who was from Bowling Green, Pike County, Missouri, filed a claim for compensation, declaring that he was the legal owner of Isaac Dunbar at the time of Isaac's enlistment. According to Thomas Dunbar's claim, which he filed on December 24th of 1866, Isaac was born and raised the slave of claimant and remained in his undisputed possession and control until enlisted in the United States service. I found that Dunbar is not the only soldier in the 102nd whose owner later filed a claim. John Russell, also in the company rolls, is listed as free, but Sarah Frizzell claimed otherwise. In January of 1867, she filed a claim for compensation for an enlisted slave, namely John Russell. According to her statement, Sarah had inherited Russell from the estate of George Bollinger and claimed that he remained her slave when he enlisted. Now, these claims for compensation do not include any evidence from either Isaac Dunbar or John Russell on their own behalf, nor is there any indication as to whether or not these claims were actually approved. But they do call into question whether the men were indeed free, as their service records indicate. And these cases illustrate the difficulty of determining the status of black men at their enlistment. In most of the military service records, there are notations of free or slave. However, they're not necessarily accurate, and they most likely depended on self-reporting. For instance, Corporal Milton Murdoch enlisted on October 5th, 1863 at Battle Creek, Michigan. Murdoch was a 45-year-old farmer. He had been born in North Carolina, and he's listed as free. Okay, it says free on or before April 1st, 1861. But when you look at his pension files, there's clear evidence that he was a slave. Milton Murdoch's first wife, Louisa, and his second wife is a whole other story, but his first wife attested that when she and Milton were married in Illinois sometime in the mid-1850s, Milton claimed to be a fugitive slave, that he had run away and that he was indeed a fugitive. If you take a look at some of the physical descriptions of Murdoch in his pension file, it describes his back as covered with scars due to blows received on it when he was a slave. And other records in his pension file mention that he changed his name from Willis Wisher to Milton Murdoch after he escaped from his owner. In Milton's eyes, he was free, but in the eyes of the law, he was still a slave when he enlisted. Evidence also indicates that some soldiers, and I know of at least 4 here, Alexander Robertson, Leroy Calloway, John Campbell, and my favorite name, Pink Rice, were slaves who somehow came into the hands of the Union Army and then were brought to Kentucky. They remained in Kentucky for a time until heading to Michigan, where they ultimately will enlist. According to various affidavits in the pension file of Harriet Robertson, who was Alexander's widow, each of these men had indeed spent time in Kentucky prior to going to Detroit. Harriet testified that she and her husband had been slaves in Alabama when they were taken by the Union Army and brought to Covington, Kentucky. Pink Rice was born in North Carolina, although I don't know where he was at the time that the Union Army confiscated him and brought him to Diamond Island, Kentucky. There, we know that he met Leroy Calloway and possibly John Campbell before they came to Detroit, and then they all enlisted. They all enlisted on the same day, November 23rd, 1863. Their records illustrate the problematic issue with the service records in that from their personal testimony, all of these men were slaves, but only Campbell and Rice were listed as slaves on their service records. The other two were listed as free. So there's a lot of difficulty in figuring out some of what these men were, their ages, their status, things like that. One of probably the most uncommon aspects of the 102nd, and that's the one that got me interested in it, is the number of Canadian blacks who served in the 1st Michigan. Records that I've gotten so far indicate that there's at least 200 soldiers somehow being connected to Canada. And that's out of, how many military service records are there? 1,647. So at least 200 are somehow connected to Canada. And there's probably more than that. At least 125 actually listed Canada as their place of birth. And that's the easiest way to figure out that they're from Canada. In addition, there were men including Samuel Lightfoot, Solomon King, as I mentioned earlier, and Benjamin Matthews, as well as others, who were either fugitive slaves or free blacks who came to Canada sometime in the decades prior to the Civil War. King and Lightfoot and Matthews, along with James Bailey, Elijah Dew, and Dabney Johnson, among others, were residents of Buxton. Others came from elsewhere in Canada, primarily Canada West. They include Henry Butler and Robert Flynn, who were born in Toronto, James Harrison from Maidstone, William Harrison, who was born in Sandwich, and Samuel Peterson, who was a native of Malden. I've also found a number of brothers who served in the regiment. I think there's a lot more that I haven't quite figured out, but I know the ones that I'll tell you here were indeed brothers. The first set was George and David York, born in Mason County, Kentucky. They came to their families with the 1850s. George York was that 15-year-old, the youngest soldier. He enlisted on October 20th of 1863. His older brother, David, and when I say older, he's only 18, enlisted 2 days later. And what I think probably happened is that George enlisted without anyone's permission, and then his brother may have enlisted to try to protect his younger brother. If he did, it isn't going to work because George fell ill within a couple of weeks of enlisting, and then he'll die in Detroit in April of consumption. David, his brother, spent the winter at Camp Ward, which is where the unit trained, and then he headed out with the unit to go to Annapolis. Sometime during those travels, he fell ill, and after about 4 months of hospitalization, he was discharged for rheumatism and chronic endocarditis. He'll suffer for heart troubles for the rest of his life. There is John and James Battles, ages 31 and 25 respectively. They enlisted at Kalamazoo on September 1st of 64. They're assigned to the same company. And there's a great deal of evidence that strongly suggests that they were brothers. They're both born in Charlottesville, Virginia. They're both carpenters. On the 1860 census, they're both listed in the same household in Niles, Barron, Michigan. They both signed their names to their enlistment papers denoting some level of literacy. And when they leave the war, or when they're done with the war, the brothers both return to Michigan and raise their families in the same town. So they're probably brothers. And then there's a couple from Canada, Alexander and Martin Pole. They were probably brothers who traveled together from Canada. They enlisted as substitutes. They specifically requested to serve in the 102nd or the 1st Michigan. There's another set of brothers, Francis and Louis Wanzer, who were also from Canada. They enlisted on November 27th, 1863, and then both of them deserted on February 4th of 1864. Presumably they returned to Canada. Despite no concrete evidence in their service records besides these similar last names, later pension records show that John and William Boyles were indeed brothers. And there's likely others that I'm trying to figure out if I can make sure that they are indeed brothers before saying they are. I've also found an uncle and a nephew who both enlisted in the 102nd, and I think I found a father and son, but I can't prove it yet. During the service, the 102nd loses 128 men, 116 of whom die of disease. Given the human devastation of the war, this number is not particularly noteworthy. Despite its relatively low mortality, the 102nd certainly was plagued with the same physical tribulations as other Civil War soldiers. And in a letter to Michigan's Lieutenant Governor Charles May, First Lieutenant Edward Cahill noted that although the 102nd's aggregate numbers had once been as high as 1,000, it had dramatically declined. In July of 1864, the number of available men was down to 721, despite the fact that the unit, according to Cahill, had never been in any engagements, and during half the time mentioned were in healthy quarters in the north. As Cahill correctly notes, much of the attrition in numbers was indeed due to disease. His reference to Camp Hill as healthy quarters, however, I've got a little bit of an issue with, given the conditions that have been described there and the extensiveness of illness there. One soldier claimed that when the company was being recruited, they were put into an old building in which they had no blankets for some time, nor beds, and the weather was cold and snow was on the ground. At least 50 men are left sick in Detroit when the unit deploys out of Detroit in March of 1864, and many of those men later either die or are discharged. At least 17 soldiers die in Michigan. Levi Artis died in February from congestive chills. Matthew Artis died from measles he contracted at Camp Ward. Jesse Stewart developed a bad cough while he was barracked at Camp Ward. He was in the hospital for a couple of months, given a little bit of a leave in order to recover, but he died in Ypsilanti. A lot of their deaths, the diseases that caused their deaths, came from exposure, and that's certainly the case in the case of George Busey. He was only 27 years old. He was a barber. He enlisted in December of 1863. And then in January, for a reason I don't know yet, he was confined in a guardhouse. And the guardhouse was described as a cold guardhouse without any fire. Well, this resulted in severely frostbitten legs and arms, which entirely disabled him. So he was subsequently discharged. If you take a look at a snapshot of the diseases that plagued the soldiers of the 102nd, it mirrors that of other Civil War regiments. Typhoid, diarrhea, and dysentery, the three most common diseases that claim the most lives in the Civil War, are very prevalent in the 102nd. Measles, smallpox, pneumonia, consumption, congestive fever are also very prevalent. But despite this pervasiveness of disease, I found that not all men die from disease, and they don't all die from battle-related injuries. Frank?
8 minutes.
Oh, wait, okay, we'll go. Frank Walker is recorded as having been murdered in Orangeburg at the end of July of 1865. Carter Wright accidentally drowned while bathing in a river near Columbus. George Lyons and John Higgins were both shot while trying to run the guards. And then there's a possibility that 2 soldiers died of poison within 3 days of each other in Detroit, Michigan. And as it sounds, there's a lot of discharges. It's not just the death, it's all these discharges. Some of the discharges are due to slipshod recruiting processes. Okay, they sort of get through when they aren't supposed to get through. John Brown's papers note that after almost a year's worth of service, Brown had performed no duty due to fits and neuralgia, which was contracted before he entered the service. Samson Charlton enlisted in December of 1863. He supposedly passed the physical exam. But shortly after he enlisted, he was hospitalized, and then 9 months later, he's discharged. This is what his discharge papers state. This man was enlisted as 44 years old, but he is in reality over 55, broken down in constitution, and totally unfit to perform the simplest camp duties. And in fact, according to the 1860 census, Charlton was then 53 years old, so the listed dates aren't always right. And then there's George Bass. George Bass was found unfit for duty due to pre-existing conditions. He's only 21 when he enlists, and he's apparently, according to his discharge papers, blind in his left eye, had much impaired vision in his right eye, and was partially deaf. He was discharged for these reasons. And I kind of wonder how in the world he engaged in his pre-war occupation of barbering, given his impaired vision. I'm not quite sure about that. And then the last thing is disciplinary issues. There's all sorts of disciplinary issues within the 102nd. Some of them are pretty serious, mutiny. Let's see, on March 27th, a private Sidney Dean, almost done. Sidney Dean was being arrested. He was arrested by a Sergeant William Simpson for disorderly conduct and drunkenness. Simpson apparently didn't want to get arrested. He turned around and he stabbed his sergeant with his bayonet. He's going to be found guilty of finding or stabbing his officer. He's sentenced to 3 years hard labor. The court further is going to say that he has to spend a certain amount of time in confinement and have a 24-pound ball and chain attached to him. He was sent to Fort Pulaski, Georgia, to serve out a sentence. However, for some reason, and I don't know why, he was later pardoned and returned to his regiment. Meanwhile, Simpson, the guy that he stabbed, is discharged for his wound because it was pretty serious. Robert and Wesley Saucer are on guard duty one night when they apparently leave for a couple of hours. They're found by a patrol at a what was called dancing house. Maybe it was a dancing house, but I really think it was what one Massachusetts soldier at one point referred to as horizontal refreshments. They pled guilty to being absent without leave, and for whatever reason, there wasn't enough evidence to substantiate the dancing house side of things, so that they were fined and given 2 weeks hard labor. And there's also a lot of disciplinary issues between the soldiers and civilians. 3 men, Augustus Ballard, Nelson Hardy, and Thomas Johnson, all went absent without leave one day, and apparently they got drunk. They stole a lot of items from various people. They threatened bodily harm to 3 civilians, and they were fined $10 each. Theodore Brown shot a hog and was fined $10 because it was the property of a civilian. When Beverly Johnson was on picket duty one day, he forcibly entered the house of a nearby civilian and stole a pair of drawers. I'm not sure why he knew those, but he did. And then last, there's the story of Wesley Blackman. He's discharged for physical disability. His disability stems from the loss of his right hand. Although his discharge papers state that this injury was caused by accidental discharge of his gun while in the line of duty, evidence suggests otherwise. And what seems to have happened, there's this letter later on in his file that says that Edward Jewett, who was his commanding officer, accused him of stealing $100 from members of his company. And he found money on Blackman's property or on his body, threatened to court-martial him for theft, and Blackman went back into his tent and shot himself. Regardless of whether it's intentional or accidentally, it certainly wasn't in the honorable discharge of duty. So in closing, the whole point of the 102nd for me is that these soldiers did not receive accolades for their heroic actions in duty. They're the ones who spend more time on picket duty and fatigue duty than they do in the front lines. They're the ones who die from disease more than battle-related wounds. And it's my hope that this larger study of the 102nd is going to show that they're more of a common experience than you get, say, out of glory. Thanks.